The modern world order is not an accident of history, but a deliberate construction. For over 70 years, the global system has been defined by a singular, overwhelming force, American hegemony. This dominance was not merely a matter of military might or territorial conquest, although those elements were certainly present. It was fundamentally a conceptual conquest, a system of power projection so sophisticated that it rendered alternatives seemingly impossible. However, the architecture of this unipolar world contained inherent contradictions, flaws that have now been systematically identified and exploited by a rising challenger. We are currently witnessing the unraveling of this order and the emergence of a fragmented, multipolar reality. This analysis explores the mechanisms of American power, the strategic response of China, and the inevitable shift toward a world of parallel systems. The anatomy of modern power projection. To understand the current geopolitical shift, we must first dissect the mechanisms that allowed the United States to dominate the global order for the better part of a century. Power in the modern era is not solely defined by the number of battleships a nation possesses or the size of its standing army. It is defined by the ability to control the flow of information, capital, and narrative. The American system rested on three pillars of power projection: information asymmetry, narrative control, and financial architecture. Information asymmetry. The first pillar is information asymmetry. In the modern world, power accrues to those who know more about others than others know about themselves. This began as a function of intelligence gathering, the vast networks of spies and surveillance systems that defined the Cold War. However, it evolved into something far more pervasive. Today, information asymmetry is maintained through technology companies, financial institutions, and multinational corporations. These entities harvest data on a global scale, creating a comprehensive map of human behavior, economic activity, and political sentiment. This system incentivizes participation. Local elites in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East often become collaborators in this structure. They extract value from their own regions, whether natural resources or human capital, and transfer their assets and knowledge into the core system for protection. By integrating into the Western information network, they gain security for their wealth and status, reinforcing the dominance of the center. Intellectual property rights, often touted as a mechanism for innovation, also serve as a tool of exclusion, ensuring that the most valuable insights remain locked within the Western ecosystem. Narrative control. The second pillar is narrative control. We consume media under the assumption that we are receiving objective information about the world. In reality, we are consuming a curated reality designed to uphold a specific worldview. This is narrative power, the ability to shape perception. Institutions such as Hollywood, the New York Times, and elite universities like Stanford and MIT are not merely cultural or educational bodies. They are components of a narrative machine. For decades, this machine successfully propagated the idea that the American way of life, liberal democracy combined with free market capitalism, was the inevitable endpoint of human development. This narrative suggested that there was no viable alternative, that history had effectively ended. By controlling the story, the West could define what was legitimate and what was rogue, what was progress and what was backwardness. This soft power was often more effective than hard power, as it convinced the world to aspire to Western standards rather than resist them. The global financial architecture, the third and perhaps most critical pillar, is the global financial architecture. The centrality of the US dollar in international trade and finance gives the United States exorbitant privilege. By controlling the SWIFT system, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, the West dictates the terms of global development. Capital flows are managed to benefit the core economies, often at the expense of the periphery. For decades, this financial hegemony allowed the U.S. to sanction adversaries, finance its own deficits cheaply, and force developing nations to adopt economic policies favorable to Western interests. It was a system of control that required no troops on the ground, only the stroke of a pen in Washington or New York. Second, the contradictions of the American system. Despite its strengths, the American system was not without flaws. There were inherent contradictions in how universally this system could apply. It promised prosperity for all who joined, yet often delivered inequality and dependency. It preached free markets, yet practiced protectionism when threatened. It championed sovereignty, yet frequently intervened in the domestic affairs of other nations. These contradictions created openings, cracks in the foundation of unipolarity. China, under its current leadership, recognized these vulnerabilities. It did not seek to confront the U.S. military directly, a strategy that would have invited immediate destruction. Instead, it chose to exploit the systemic contradictions of the American order. China's strategy was one of strategic patience, participating in the existing order to build capability while simultaneously constructing parallel structures to challenge it. Third, the rise of the challenger. China's strategic ecosystem. China's rise is often framed in the West as a threat, but structurally, it represents the emergence of an alternative ecosystem. China resolved three key issues that allowed it to become a peer competitor to the United States: productive power, currency alternatives, and ideological non-interference. The manufacturing ecosystem. First, China established itself as the workshop of the world. It is not merely a country, it is a massive economic ecosystem that represents the bulk of the modern world's productive capacity. While the West financialized its economy, moving towards services and speculation, China focused on the tangible. It built roads, bridges, ports, and factories on a scale unprecedented in human history. This productive power gives China enormous leverage. The world depends on the Eastern manufacturing complex for everything from basic consumer goods to advanced electronics. By controlling the means of production, China ensured that it could not be easily isolated. Its massive infrastructure capacity and technological momentum created a gravitational pull that few nations could resist. Alternative settlement mechanisms. Second, China addressed the vulnerability of dollar dependence. For years, the U.S. weaponized the dollar, using sanctions to cut off nations from the global economy. China recognized that true sovereignty required financial autonomy. It began to develop alternative settlement mechanisms, currency swaps, local currency trade agreements, and the digital yuan. These mechanisms allow nations to trade without dollar intermediation. If Brazil wants to sell soy to China, or if Russia wants to sell oil to India, they no longer need to route the transaction through New York. This reduces the friction of trade and creates a safety valve against American sanctions. It is a direct challenge to the financial pillar of Western hegemony, ideological non-interference. Third, and perhaps most strategically, China adopted a stance of ideological non-interference. The American system demands systemic change. To join the Western club, a nation must often adopt specific political and economic reforms. China offered a different deal, a relationship based on development, not ideology. China positioned itself as a development partner. It told the world, we do not care how you run your country. We do not demand that you become like us. We only care about doing business. This approach resonated deeply with the global South. Nations in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia that were tired of Western lectures on governance while suffering from Western economic extraction. China offered infrastructure, loans, and trade without the political strings attached by the IMF or World Bank. Fourth, the clash of global orders, the friction between these two systems, the American unipolar order and the emerging Chinese multipolar order, has defined the geopolitics of the 21st century. Theoretical frameworks of international relations. To understand this clash, we must briefly look at the theoretical lenses through which international relations are viewed. Traditionally, scholars debate between realism, power is all that matters, liberalism, institutions and rules matter, constructivism, ideas and identities matter, and Marxism, economic structures and class relations matter. In the post-Cold War era, however, new frameworks emerged. Network theory, popularized by Manuel Castells, suggested that power lies in the space of flows and the network enterprise. If you control the networks of connectivity, you control the world. The U.S. embraced this. dominating the digital and financial networks. Conversely, the traditional hegemon view, championed by American policymakers, held that global order is imposed through rules and enforcement. The US established the rules and it enforced them. This worked when there was no peer competitor. But as China rose, it challenged both the network dominance and the rule-based enforcement of the US. The Chinese model, adaptive and pragmatic. China's approach was distinct. It was adaptive, pragmatic, and patient. The Chinese model of learning by doing meant absorbing Western technology and expertise. They welcomed foreign investment not just for capital, but for knowledge transfer. They were pragmatic, prioritizing results over ideology. If a policy worked to generate growth, it was kept. If not, it was discarded. This focus on state capacity, the ability to plan strategically and execute effectively, set China apart. While Western democracies often became paralyzed by endless debate and bureaucratic process, and while other developing nations like India struggled to implement their ambitious plans, China delivered. It built high-speed rail networks, modernized its cities, and lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. This demonstrated competence, won over many skeptics in the developing world who prioritized prosperity over political theory. Strategic patience and the pivot. For decades, China practiced strategic patience. It integrated into the World Trade Organization, WTO, accepted the dollar-based trading system, and embedded itself in global supply chains. It made itself indispensable. It avoided direct confrontation, building its capabilities below the threshold of threat. The West, for its part, believed in convergence theory, the idea that as China grew richer, it would inevitably become more liberal, democratic, and Western. This was a comforting narrative, but it was false. China grew, but it did not conform. It maintained its unique political system while mastering Western capitalism. Around 2011, the US realized its error. The Obama administration announced the pivot to Asia, a strategic rebalancing meant to address the rising challenge of China. This marked the end of the era of engagement and the beginning of the era of containment. Fifth escalation, from trade war to tech war, the tension escalated rapidly. What began as economic integration turned into strategic competition. The US realized that the asymmetry of the relationship, China accessing Western markets while protecting its own, was unsustainable. The National Security Strategy. In 2017, the US formalized this shift. The National Security Strategy explicitly designated China as a strategic competitor. This was a watershed moment. It signaled that the cooperative framework was dead. The US would no longer aid China's rise, it would actively seek to constrain it. To do this, the US mobilized two complementary strategies: technology restrictions and alliance coordination. Technology restrictions. The goal of technology restrictions is to deny access. By cutting off China from cutting-edge semiconductors and other critical technologies, the US hoped to slow China's development trajectory. The logic was simple. If China cannot buy the chips it needs, its technological progress will stall. However, this strategy often backfires. Denial of access forces the adversary to pursue alternatives. China responded by pouring immense resources into its own technological sovereignty. Made in China 2025 became a roadmap for self-sufficiency in strategic sectors. While restrictions imposed short-term pain, they accelerated China's long-term independence. Alliance coordination, recognizing that it could not contain China alone, the US sought to build coalitions. The Indo-Pacific strategy was the operational architecture for this regional containment. By aligning with nations like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India, the US aimed to surround China with a network of security partners. Domestically, this confrontation was rationalized through the narrative of threat. Politicians and media outlets framed China not just as a competitor, but as an existential threat to the Western way of life. This unified political support for aggressive measures that would have previously been unthinkable. Sixth, the fragmentation of the world system. As the US pushed for containment and decoupling, the world system began to fracture. We are no longer moving toward a single, integrated global market. We are moving toward fragmentation, a world divided into competing blocks with parallel systems. The layers of fragmentation. This fragmentation is occurring at multiple levels. Trade settlement at the base layer. We see the shift away from the dollar. Nations are increasingly settling trade in local currencies. This de-dollarization is slow but steady, eroding the financial leverage of the West. Development financing. Above that, there is a split in development financing. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, provides an alternative to the World Bank. Developing nations can now choose between Western loans with strict conditionality and Chinese loans focused on infrastructure. Technological decoupling. In the tech sector, we see a bifurcation. There is a Western tech stack and a Chinese tech stack. Countries are being forced to choose which digital ecosystem they will inhabit. Will they use Huawei or Ericsson, GPS or Beidou? Systemic competition. Finally, at the highest level, there is ideological contestation. It is a battle between the liberal rules-based order and a multipolar world sovereignty. The logic of multipolarity for the global South. This fragmentation is actually an opportunity. Multipolarity means options. In a unipolar world, nations had no choice but to accept Western terms. If the IMF demanded austerity, you accepted austerity. If the US demanded sanctions compliance, you complied. Now, alternatives exist. If the West refuses to fund a dam or a railway, a country can turn to China. If the US restricts technology, there are other suppliers. Sovereignty requires options. Without alternatives, sovereignty is just a word. China's strategy has been to provide those alternatives, to create infrastructure, financing, and trade networks that allow developing nations to exercise genuine agency. This was visibly demonstrated at the BRICS Expansion Summit in Johannesburg. The expansion of the BRICS bloc was a symbolic declaration that the monopoly of the G7 was over. The developing world signaled that it would no longer accept a second-tier status in international affairs. Seventh, the Western response, rigidity and overreaction. Faced with this challenge, the West has largely resisted adaptation. Instead of reforming the global institutions to give developing nations a greater voice, the West has doubled down on defense. It clings to dominance, viewing any challenge to its centrality as a threat to stability. This rigidity leads to brittleness. When a system refuses to bend, it risks breaking. The Western response has often been counterproductive. By weaponizing the financial system through sanctions, the West has accelerated the very de-dollarization it fears. By banning Chinese technology, it has spurred Chinese innovation. The narrative from the West is one of stability. They argue, we maintain peace and prosperity for decades, therefore we deserve to remain in charge. But for much of the world, that stability looked like stagnation or exploitation. The West's insistence on continuity is seen by the global South as an attempt to lock in an unfair hierarchy. Eighth, the inevitability of parallel systems. We are now in a trajectory of irreversible fragmentation. It is strategically rational for nations to reduce their dependence on any single power. Just as a diversified investment portfolio is safer, a diversified set of geopolitical partnerships is more secure. The world is witnessing the emergence of parallel systems that will coexist, compete, and occasionally conflict. The unipolar moment is over. We are entering an era where the US dollar is still powerful but not omnipotent, where Western technology is advanced but not exclusive, and where Western values are influential but not universal. The role of the Global South. The battleground for this new era is the Global South. These nations, representing the majority of the world's population and a significant portion of its resources, are the swing states. They do not want a new Cold War. They do not want to be forced to choose sides. They want to trade with both the US and China. They want investment from both Europe and Asia. China understands this. Its strategy is to enable this autonomy. By providing the infrastructure for independent trade and development, China aligns itself with the interests of the Global South. It positions itself not as a new hegemon, but as a partner in multipolarity. The West conversely often demands loyalty. It frames the competition as democracy versus autocracy, forcing a binary choice that many nations resent. If the West continues to demand exclusivity while China offers inclusivity, the strategic advantage will tilt toward Beijing. Ninth, the new reality of sovereignty. The lecture underscores a fundamental shift in the nature of global power. For 70 years, power was centralized, hierarchical, and Western. Today, it is becoming distributed, networked, and multipolar. America wants China to play the game of being a responsible stakeholder in the American-led order, to rise, but only within the constraints set by Washington. China has refused this role. It has chosen instead to build a new game board. This transition is fraught with danger. The friction between a declining hegemon and a rising challenger creates instability. Technology wars, trade disputes, and proxy conflicts are the symptoms of this structural shift. However, for the majority of the world, this is also a moment of liberation. The monopoly on power is breaking. The future will not be defined by a single global village under one flag. It will be defined by fragmentation, competition, and the complex interplay of parallel systems. In this new world, sovereignty will be defined by the capacity to choose, to navigate between powers, to access alternative systems, and to leverage the competition for national benefit. The era of automatic compliance is gone. The era of strategic autonomy has begun. Understanding this shift is not just an academic exercise, it is essential for navigating the reality of the 21st century. The world has changed, and there is no going back.